And we are live. Three, two, one. Welcome back to Boilers Extra. I'm Nathan Baird from the Indianapolis Star.
Sam King from the Journal and Courier.
We should just start introducing each other. Like whoever talks first, just introduce the other one. I don't know. unless we like demand, we have to have our screen time. We have to have our voice time up front. But yeah, it's the end of preseason camp. Sam and I, we're recording this on Thursday. Sam and I were just out at Purdue's final preseason camp practice of 2024 on Friday. They're going to do a walkthrough. They're basically this week has been about sort of pre-creating a game week. Thursday practices this week, or Tuesday, Wednesday practice, I should say. Like it was a little bit more of an install kind of thing, or actually really more Wednesday, Thursday. And then Friday, they're going to do a walkthrough as they do every Friday during the season before game. And then Saturday, they're going to do what I was told was sort of like a mock game, which is not going out and playing football, but it's more about crowd noise. They'll be in the stadium. So like crowd noise, clock, like going through scenarios, because that's something you don't necessarily get to do while you're working on nuts and bolts football things throughout the season, much like a game would be. And then next week, it's the real thing as you're getting ready for Indiana State. So today's topic is going to be bold predictions for 2024. I thought we'd go bold, bolder, boldest. Like we'll start off with something that's like, oh, okay, that's up an upside thing for Purdue. And then at the end, it's going to be like, all right, well, if everything goes perfect, here's what could be on the table. And before we get to that, as we wrapped up preseason camp, Sam, today, other non-injury related things, because there are some guys who are still out that we think are going to be big parts of this team that won't be there for the season opener. Barring injury related things, did you get to the end of camp and get the questions answered that you had about this team coming into the season, short of, once they get on the field, it will actually be the answer?
Yeah, obviously there's always going to be questions until there's an actual game where there are officials and there's a scoreboard that's telling the team with the most points and determining a winner. But for the most part, I think we're there. Clearly there's, I still think the kicker question's up in the air. That's not a dying need, like something that I went into camp saying, coming out of this, I better know who the starting kicker is going into week 1 against Indiana State. And we might not know who the starting kicker is even after the Indiana State game, as sometimes these things unfold as the season goes on. But I would say for the most part, having covered this team now for a couple of years and then kind of as a secondary reporter for this team for, 17, 18 years.
An eon.
Yeah. I feel like I have a pretty good grasp. The big thing last year was it was a whole new staff. Everything was different. So there was a lot of questions. And I don't think coming out of camp, we probably had clarity on several things. And that's not the case this year. I feel like I'm in a pretty good position of understanding what we're going to see on August 31st.
I think Purdue knows more about itself on opening day than it probably did a year ago. And that's important. That's important. Like they are a little bit more sure of themselves, a lot more sure of themselves, I think. Like they've just been around even the transfers coming in, as Ryan Walters has pointed out a few times, the vast bulk of those guys came in last winter. We're here in the spring. So while some of this is going to be new to them, it's a lot of veteran guys, and it's a lot of guys who have kind of come together. And that's why they're ending this camp with, I think, some real optimism about coming out and surprising some people in some ways this season against what we've discussed many times is a pretty tough schedule. And I also want to point out, like something like the kicker situation with Ben Freehill, Spencer Porath, the way that this schedule lines up, yes, it's got its very tough parts, but it starts off maybe in a really good way for Purdue, where you get to have the Indiana State game, and not taking anything away from them, but it's the identity of your kicker and some guys being out on the fringes here should not determine the outcome of that game. That's a game that Purdue should be comfortably winning. And so you get to maybe both kickers play in a game like this, and you get some like real game data to make this final decision with. Yeah. And then and that can be true of some other positions too. And now you come out of that game, make an assessment of that, and then you've got a week. And as much as you are obviously going to take the advantage to start preparing for Notre Dame during that empty week, you also get to reconfigure some things based on what you learned in the opener. So I think that it's not ideal. I think in a perfect world, I think Ryan Walters would rather have that first bye come a little bit later in the season and have them both sort of more towards the middle instead of having one at the beginning. But the way it's setting them up to maybe have their best shot at Notre Dame, it might work out pretty well.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I guess that we'll kind of jump into going from there, just making some predictions. We have not discussed this with each other. I don't know what Nathan's going to pick, and he doesn't know what I'm going to pick. As far as the predictions go, just kind of a off the cuff type of thing. But I'll let Nathan start. Kind of, what is your first bold prediction about this team? Because you had covered this team for years, and then you left and went and covered Ohio State for a period of time, and now you're back, and you've only seen Purdue, kind of as an outsider. Now you've been around for the last 3 weeks here of camp.
Yeah, and it's been interesting to come back and look at a team. These are obviously teams that are built differently. It's programs that are built differently. It is universities that operate differently. Certainly the athletic departments operate somewhat differently. There's just a larger scale of things at Ohio State. But when it comes down to winning football games, and they're trying to win, they're in the same conference. They're even going to play each other, but the standard that they're judged against is significantly different. And I think that to some extent, football is football, and there's things that every football team is going to have to do in order to win games. So we talked about this pretty extensively on the post-game video that post-practice video on Thursday from the last preseason camp practice. But my first prediction, and this is going to be, I swear they're not all going to be this dry. This is going to sound like I'm doing like an accounting presentation. Purdue holds opponents under 5.25 yards per play. Now, that is not like an outrageous number. That is not going to be, if you're the best team in the Big Ten, you're probably like a yard under that. Like 5.25 is not that great. But to call it a bold prediction, it's still almost a half yard better than where they were last year, half yard per play. And again, I'm not trying to get too nerdy on this, but that's a significant amount. Like over the course of a game, over the course of a season, you are putting yourself in position to win a lot more games by being at a number like that. 5.72, I think they were at last year. That makes you one of the 3 or 4 worst teams in the Big Ten. 5.25 doesn't jump you all the way to the top, but it puts you very comfortably in the middle. And this team being very comfortably in the middle on both defense and offense gives them a chance to come out of the 6 or 7 games that they have against the other Big Ten teams that are very comfortably in the middle and run the table on those games or win enough of those games to have an improvement over last year. The reason why I think this is going to happen is it all kind of comes back to one thing, and it's they have improved. Well, it's 2 things that are related to each other. They improved the overall talent level in the defense. They lost a player in Nick Scourton, and I don't know that they replaced him with any one player as good as Nick Scourton. I'm sure they didn't. I am pretty high on Nyland Green, but I don't know if he's – as a corner, you can't have that same impact that you have as an NFL-type edge rusher. But the talent level at every position almost probably is better than it was last year. You still have Dylan Thieneman. You still have now KJ Jenkins moving to what might be a better position for him. It certainly is where he projects to play as a professional football player at Mike linebacker or inside linebacker in some capacity. So when you do that, the corollary to that is they should have less problems giving up big plays. All of these things that we're predicting today are obviously like not necessarily best case scenario, but it's like, obviously if there's injuries, if there's other problems like that affects things. But like all things being equal, this team should give up fewer. It was the worst team in the Big Ten last year, 29 plays of 30 plus yards. I think that number should be under 20 at the very least this year with the talent that they've added and the depth of quality that they now have in the defense. Again, I'm not predicting that this defense catapults to the top of the Big Ten, but to say they're going to cut a half yard per game off of their yards allowed, half yard per play off their yards allowed, like that really adds up over the course of a season.
Yeah, that's a pretty good take and not wildly outlandish, I don't think, because certainly the defense is capable, and I feel like the defense last year was capable. But as you mentioned, those 30 plus, 20 plus, I think in the 8 losses, I counted up 46 plays of 20 plus yards last year, and that's those are backbreakers, especially when you feel like you do a lot of good things and then you have those.
Yeah.
If you take one of those away a game, two of those away a game, that significantly decreases that average.
Yeah, also, like, you got to remember, like, they're going to give up yards to Oregon and Ohio State. Everybody in the country is going to give up yards to Oregon and Ohio State. I don't know how you keep those offenses below a certain level. Like, they're just, we're not talking about equal things here, as much as we pretend that we are sometimes. So that's going to affect it. Like, you have a tough schedule. There's yards already baked into this schedule that you can't take off probably. But I think overall you're going to see an improved defensive performance. It's just more certainty, more reasonable expectation of solid play at every position on the field on defense. I think it's going to just be a more solid. You're raising the floor on this defense. And again, I'm sure to hear it talked about that way is probably not going to be exciting to fans. It's probably not what someone like Ryan Walters would be saying about his own team at this point in the season. But when you're analyzing it, you can see where that takes a team that last year had problems beating those middle of the Big Ten teams, or at least finishing off the wins, and how it can maybe push themselves into a place where they come out with more wins and losses in those situations. What's your first bold prediction?
Well, it's kind of not as in depth probably as yours was, but I put my first bold prediction as Purdue makes a bowl game. And to do that, to become bowl eligible, Purdue has to win 6 games. And I think it's quite possible. We've talked about, there's probably 4 games on the schedule that most people are chalking up as automatic losses. That leaves 8 games, and you've got to win 6 of those. Definitely possible. We've talked about, we watch this team every day and think this is not a bad football team. This is certainly a team that can go out and win 6 or 7 games in the regular season. Now, that said, injuries do become a factor at some point, and every team has them. I think Gus Hartwig said today, if you play football long enough, it's not if you get injured, it's when you get injured, because all these guys at some point get beat up. Very rarely does a guy go through his entire college career and start every single game. So that's probably a factor. But I just think that when you look at what the schedule is, take away Notre Dame, Penn State, Oregon, Ohio State, I think Purdue has more talent than, maybe not all 8 of those other games, but at least 6 of them, at least 5 of them. And then it's just having to sway one game one way or the other. It's a lot of times last year, like you said, didn't finish off those games that it could have won. Northwestern, Iowa, Syracuse, whatever it might be, Fresno State. I really feel like Purdue should have been a bowl team, all things considered, with all the injuries and everything it had last year. It was just a big play or 2 every single game that was crushing. And at the end of the season, that became the difference of, not having that extra game. And then on top of that, all those extra weeks of practice leading up to whenever the bowl game is, which I also think is pretty valuable when you're trying to build a program, especially last year as a first-year staff. This year, I think Purdue can get back to a bowl game, and I think back to the Citrus Bowl that I covered a couple of years ago, which was a catastrophe because all of Purdue's top players opted out. LSU's also did, but LSU had enough depth that it didn't matter, and also had Jaden Daniels playing quarterback against a lot of second unit guys. So, and I remember talking to Ryan Walters on the field that day because he'd recently been hired as the coach, flew out to Orlando, was on the field watching the game, and he was looking and saying, like, there's some talented guys here, knowing full well a lot of those guys weren't going to be on his roster moving forward. But he kind of felt like he was walking into a situation where, Purdue had been in the Big Ten championship game, looked like a team that was, maybe going to sustain some success. And then last year, just kind of things snowballed. Now you've got, kind of like we talked, Purdue's in a better situation going into this year. That whole additional spring and then that continuity that the staff's built, the transfers that came in, kind of are coming into a culture where guys already have established something last year. And, as tough as last year was watching a 4-8 team, I felt like every single player that we talked to throughout the entire year was bought into what Purdue was trying to do and knew, like, man, this stinks. We're losing some of these games we feel like we could have won, but none of those players' heads were down or feeling like, oh, let's give up on the season. Instead, no, you go out, you win a game that's very competitive to the last play of the season against Indiana and finish on a high note. Beat Minnesota there a couple of weeks before that, and really kind of took some momentum into the off season, even though a lot of guys left in the transfer portal. The guys that came back felt like, things started clicking at the end of last season. And I think that carried over into the spring. We saw kind of that same, feel and culture, and that something was building here at Purdue. And now because of that, I think the games that maybe were losses last year that were down to the wire and Purdue found a way to lose rather than finding a way to win, Purdue wins, 1, 2, 3 more of those and is able to get to the 6-win mark needed to get to a bowl game.
Listen, there's probably going to be some challenges along the way to that cohesion, to that culture that you're talking about. Like it's easy to talk about culture when there isn't a lot of adversity, and there's potential for adversity here. If things don't go best case scenario early, I really think like the Oregon State, Nebraska back-to-back, going at Oregon State, coming home to start the Big Ten against Nebraska, is just a massive point of the season. If you can't beat Notre Dame and you beat Indiana State, now you're 1-1. And if you come out of those two games at 3-1 versus coming out of them 1-3, it's massively different because you still have 3 top 10 teams to play after that, and at Wisconsin and other challenges. So conversely, if you come out of that 3-1, I think you're in great shape to have one of the more pleasantly surprising seasons in the Big Ten. If you come out of that 1-3, though, that's where you're going to have the culture really has to step up. So I'm going to be curious to see if you're reading that right, but I think you might be. And it'll also be reflective of the culture if they just don't get to that point. If they do something better than that and get off to a good start and build off of kind of the momentum they had last year. But I feel like you're starting off pretty bold. Like to say bowl game is with this schedule is you'd be one of the few people out there. In fact, there are people out there who go through and predict like every bowl game in the country. And I'm not sure I've seen anybody else predict Ohio State to make a bowl, but we are getting, these are bold predictions. And these aren't necessarily predictions we would go put a lot of money on, but it's predictions that, again, it's like best case scenario. Here's something that is, I think, plausible that could happen.
There's always somebody who takes this and puts it away, and then when it doesn't happen at the end of the season, they come out on social media and say, hey, you idiot, you're like, it happens all the time. Somebody did it to me last year, and I was like, the predictions I made in August, I don't even remember what they were, honestly, come late November, December, and somebody does. So
last season is also who you had so many unknowns of that. And I think, this year, hopefully, we're in better position to make that analysis just because there's more foundation here with what they did last year and knowing the personalities and the people and the way that they handle things. So my second boldest prediction. So we went from bold to bolder. This is my bolder prediction, not Boulder, Colorado, but bolder in terms of audacity. I'm going Hudson Card is third team All Big Ten, not first or second, but third team All Big Ten. But at the same time, that does mean that he would be beating out someone from a list that is going to include Dylan Gabriel, Will Howard at Ohio State, Drew Aller from Penn State, Miller Moss from USC. There's a couple other guys in there that are returners that are solid quarterbacks. This is about to become, I already wrote something about this a couple weeks ago. Like this used to be a conference that was not known for quarterback play and was almost known for its lack of quarterback play. Like it was weird that like Tom Brady came out of the Big Ten. He didn't even have that great of a Michigan career. And he goes on to be like the greatest quarterback of all time. But it was just like so fluky that you would get Big Ten quarterbacks to then go on and have the success that you saw them having from other conferences. And now you're taking some of those conferences or some of those teams that very regularly have produced pretty good quarterbacks, whether it's Oregon or USC and UCLA and even Washington at times. Michael Penix, I know he didn't start there, but that's who he left to go to be a top 10 draft pick. Like you're bringing those teams into the Big Ten, and it's going to be harder for Purdue to separate itself in terms of quarterback play. And I think having great quarterback play in the future is going to be every year. It's going to be even more and more crucial. But I think it's attainable for Hudson Card this year. This is, again, it's like a best case scenario situation. So you don't know if any of those other guys I just listed off are even going to finish the season. So if Hudson Card plays a full healthy season, that gives him a leg up on some guys. He finally has some receivers. Jamal Edrin, I think, had a really strong camp. They like what CJ Smith is going to be when he is back healthy. Shamar Rigby has come along and given them what may only be down the line a fourth option, but that's still a really strong fourth option, and he may end up being better than that. They have to. I don't know that you necessarily like defer to a true freshman because you have to go win games, but the more he can be involved this year and Purdue can show him that it's going to use him, like I think that's better for maybe his long-term career here at Purdue too. But also when you just look inside the numbers, there's some reason for optimism about Hudson Card. And I should warn people that I do tend to I don't care about counting stats as much when I'm evaluating things. I don't care as much about yards per game for an offense or a defense or a quarterback. It's more about the metrics and the different ways of evaluating things. I think you can be the more nuanced ways to evaluate things. Hudson Card still had a 2-to-1 interception ratio. That's not incredible, but it's still 15-8 is, I think, a good baseline to set. He completed less than 60% of his passes. I think that number is absolutely going to go up just based on the receiving talent he'll be working with this year. I just think there's more sure-handed guys and guys that he'll feel confident in throwing the ball to. By direct correlation to that, his yards per attempt is going to go up. Last year was 6.5, which is on the low end of adequate, even for the Big Ten. The best quarterbacks are up 8, 9, and beyond that. And it's again, I think that's sometimes reflective of the whole offense. If you don't have guys catching the ball more, it's going to hurt you. And that keeps his rating down in that 120 range, which again is middle of the pack Big Ten. But I think he needs to at least be on the top half of the middle of the pack, if that makes sense. I don't think, again, you have to expect Hudson Card to come out and evolve into Drew Brees, but I think he has to take a step forward off of what he was last year. I think last year was, especially given these circumstances, pretty solid. I think he needs to take it a step beyond that now that he has the weapons. Now he's got a better offensive line in front of him, and assuming stays a more healthy and intact offensive line in front of him. And he's in the second year of a system. There's more of a connection with him and Graham Harrell. There's a lot of signs that would tell you he can move up. His performance can move up. And I also don't. There's some other guys that I mentioned on that list that I'm not a huge fan of. As I think they're a little bit overrated, Drew Aller being one of them. So I think there's an opening there for someone. If Hudson Card comes out and performs the way we're talking, that is maybe on the table for him, and it pushes Purdue up as well. Now Purdue is having a better season than people expected. Then I think that puts him in the conversation to be one of the guys who gets those kind of votes at the end of the year.
Yeah, and that I think back to 2 years ago. Hudson Card is at Texas. He's Quinn Ewers back up. He comes in, plays against Alabama, and I think Texas dang near beats Alabama, which was, as it has been for 15 years, one of the best teams in college football. And I think that was a sign that he could play. And knowing what I know now, he probably didn't want to sit around at Texas for the rest of his career and just wait for opportunities, knowing he wasn't going to elevate himself to the top of the depth chart, which is why he ends up at Purdue, and why Purdue made its first priority once Ryan Walters was hired and once Graham Harrell came on board. That Walters went to Texas, met Graham Harrell at an airport, and they went to Hudson Card's house and said, "Hey, our first order of business as the coaching staff is we need you to come and be the quarterback of this thing." And clearly he was on board because he was in the portal just a couple of days, and all of a sudden Purdue has this new quarterback. Because of the system last year and what we apparently didn't know about it at this point, because all I think that was talked about was air raid, and we know Graham Harrell threw for 1 million yards at Texas Tech. Just thought that Hudson Card was going to throw the ball all over the football field, and it was going to be a very one-dimensional offense, and that ended up being almost kind of the opposite by the end of the year. Purdue was, its strength was really running the football at the end of the season with Tyrone Tracy and Devin Mockbee, but you did see flashes of a really good play from Hudson Card last year. And this is with, outside of Deion Burks, once defenses realized what he was, really didn't have a lot of options to throw the ball to at times. And then Deion Burks goes to Oklahoma, and you're thinking, you really lost the only true talented receiver or top-notch receiver that you had, at least your number one receiver. And I think Purdue has a lot more weapons, is more versatile, and that's going to open things up. You might not have a 1,000-yard receiver, but you could have 700, 500, and then a bunch of guys in like the 200, 300, 400 range, and all those numbers add up. And when they vote on all Big Ten teams, clearly people look at stats, look at wins, but also kind of look at where were you a year ago and what did you if this program does get to a bowl game, as I just I guess boldly predicted, Hudson Card is going to have to elevate his game. And if Purdue gets to a bowl game, somebody's going to say, what was the difference from a year ago to this year? And if Hudson Card has a great season, I think that, gets him some votes from the coaches, from the people who vote for the all Big Ten teams.
And again, I just feel like total yards, whatever. Sometimes you get a lot of total yards because you're giving up a lot of points and you're getting the ball back a lot or whatever. You know what I mean? Like the yards can be empty and they can be indicative more just of how many plays you ran than how well you actually performed on each of those plays, if that makes sense. Yeah. And I think where you have to see improvement for this offense is, try not to be 11th in the Big Ten in third down conversions. Try not to be 13th in the Big Ten in scoring percentage in the red zone, and 11th in touchdown percentage in the red zone. Like you've got to raise those numbers. You've got to. It's about capitalizing on opportunities and being more efficient in the most crucial times. Like really executing in the margins. It's just about getting on top of the middle. Like it sounds so boring to talk about. And at the same time, they're trying to build something here, and they're trying to build something in the face of a pretty challenging schedule potentially here. So to just take yourself and flip yourself from the team that couldn't execute well enough in those positions, now you're just to move up 3 spots in all of those metrics puts you in a chance to win so many more games when you're looking on the aggregate of the season, because you're probably still going to be less successful against those 4 top 10 teams in all of those categories. So then if you're still improving in all those categories, just think of how well that means you played in all those other games, those other 8 games that we've been talking about. So I'm just really interested in how they kind of execute better. Like if it's, and how much of that is on him though, also is on Hudson Card to just be sharper himself, like, make better decisions and be more efficient with the ball.
I'm going to go on the other side of the ball for my bolder prediction and say that Will Helt will have double-digit sacks. And that seems outlandish when you look at the guy had 12 total tackles last season and was mostly, on special teams. But when you factor in, and I know that the 2 guys who were on the edge last year are, one's for sure probably going to the NFL after this season. The other one is making a move to another position that better benefits him to help get him to the NFL.
But both NFL players. Like I think both those guys are in it. Scourton and Jenkins, both NFL players.
Yes, absolutely. But the way this defense was designed, Scourton leads the Big Ten last year in sacks. Jenkins is, I believe, 3rd, but between them had 17.5 sacks. This defense gets after the quarterback, and those guys had a ton of quarterback pressures too, where, maybe they're not sacks, but you force the quarterback to run out of the pocket and just throw the ball out of bounds, or, throw it into pressure and Dylan Thieneman picks it off, or whoever, a lot of good things happen when you put pressure on the quarterback, and this defense is really predicated towards it. We've heard how Will Helt is just this menace, this what was the word, Terminator, that that was used earlier this year. I think that when you look at him, he is 6'6", 250 pounds, and he's not slow. Like he's fast off the ball. He's aggressive with, I've watched him pretty much every day in drills, and the way he attacks a tackling dummy. And I know that real life human beings that are trying to stop you are a little bit different, but the way he goes at it every day is just kind of maniacal, to wanting to be perfect on every single rep. And I think that that's probably why these types of players, the Thienemans, the Will Helts, the players like that, become the great players that they ultimately become. As you know, Will Helt's probably on his way to becoming, because of the way they train and work. And then obviously he has some God-given talents, just being 6'6" and having the body and the frame to put on that kind of weight and still be fast and physical. But I think he's a guy who can get 10 sacks this year. And if he does, that goes back to your probably bold prediction. This team will definitely limit some of those big plays and obviously knock down that yards per play average.
Well, not necessarily, because they had the sacks last year and it didn't help them as far as preventing the big plays. And I think this is a defense that is aggressive and it's going to take chances. So that exposes you sometimes to bigger plays. And I think there's a certain amount of that is a give and take, but they took too much. Or what do I say? They gave too much, even more than what they were taking, when they were taking a pretty substantial amount in terms of sacks, tackles for loss, takeaways. To think that you have like the top two of the top three guys in the Big Ten and one of the top two guys in sacks and TFLs and one of the top two guys in the Big Ten in almost the whole nation in interceptions and still had problems on defense was indicative, I think, of the talent level across the board. So now if you raise that talent level across the board and you still have those impact players, even if some of the names have changed, I think that's why that improvement could come. And with Will Helt, I've been impressed too. We haven't got to see like a bunch of live periods necessarily where I think we've gotten a great assessment of the pass rush. The quarterbacks aren't live. It's very different too. And on top of all that, Purdue has obviously had to jumble things up on the offensive line and hasn't always had its number one option at left tackle in the game, in those scrimmage situations. So assuming that is still Corey Stewart. So he's going to face some challenges in this conference. This is a conference that with a lot of teams that are known for producing offensive line talent. I think I think it's within reach for him just because of the scheme. The scheme is going to lend itself to, as it did last year, what pass rushers can do in this scheme. But I'm also really intrigued by what's happening at the other defensive end spot, where it looked like CJ Madden was maybe going to be the guy early in camp. And, when we were asking about his injury situation, which was brief, Ryan Walters said something like, thank God it's only, it's minimal. And because I think you could see in his reaction, like how important and how significant he feels like CJ Madden could be for this defense. But then Sheeta Silla has stepped up and started taking a lot of first team reps here in the last week and a half of camp, almost to where it seems like he maybe is the guy who would be out there to start a game. Now, I was asking Marcus Johnson about this today, offensive line coach, because I wanted kind of his take on how intriguing those two guys can be to get, like, what kind of a problem does it create for an offensive line when you have Sheeta Silla out there for one play and you might run CJ Madden onto the field for the next play? Because the way that you are trying, those two guys are throwing very different things at you, very different pass rush skills at you, very different body types. And depending on who you are, you may match up much better against one than the other. And it could just really throw you off on any given. So it's those three guys, but that combination of guys that I think is really intriguing, that I think Will Helt, if he stands alone and becomes a guy that you can't take off the field because of his play, that's obviously a great development. And if you're getting these other two guys who in combination, or the three of them in combination, because Will Helt also is a little bit different of a body type than either of those two guys, right? Like, he's a little bit more like Sheeta Silla, but it's not exactly the same with his length. So that threesome, that triumvirate, I think is really intriguing to me, because I saw what Purdue was able to do off the edge last year in this defense. And if they can find a way to replicate it in the aggregate with the improved secondary that it really appears that they have, now you're talking about a big step forward on defense.
Yeah. And, kind of, you touched on this, but when you don't get to the quarterback, that's when things happen. And I talked about those 20+ yard plays that Purdue had in its losses last year that it gave up. I think 10 of those were against Syracuse, where Garrett Schrader ran for 200 and some yards against Purdue because you just couldn't get in the backfield and take him down. And so, if you're gonna take these chances, you have to at least get to the quarterback and make him, make a play that he doesn't want to make, whether that's releasing the ball early, throwing the ball out of bounds, or taking a sack, versus being able to find the open seam that you've created by opening up the space and turning that into 10, 15, 20 plus yards. So, but I do think that's, because Purdue made last year, it was Jenkins and it was Gordon, and Will Helt was 18 years old and still trying to figure out college football a little bit at that point when he came in there and was getting the few reps that he did on the defense. Now you've got Silla, who's started for Boston College. You have Madden, who's been at Georgia and, played with some of the best defensive players in all of college football the last couple of years. And then you have Helt, who's now experienced, gone through a spring as a number one guy. And then you even bring in Jairo Jada from Franklin, who was an All-American at the Division III level, which, you think that's a massive jump, but it's another guy who has experience playing college football, who's kind of pushing these guys to step up their game and gives you that kind of comfort that he can come in and even play at times. I think this is a need for Ryan Walters' defense to work the way that it is designed to work, which is, he's got the corners now that he supposedly wants in Green and Breedlove, with Brown, and then you got Thieneman, you got Antonio Stevens. The defensive front looks a lot better than it did a year ago, and now you've got kind of the mix of pass rushers, but it seems like out of that bunch, Will Helt will be the guy that is on the field for a majority of the snaps, and kind of some of the others will just fit in alternating series or plays or whatever it might be.
So defense is what sort of sets the stage for my boldest prediction. And actually, I've been thinking about it, and it's actually probably not that bold of a prediction now that I'm going to explain why I'm picking it. I actually tried to get myself to a place where I could pick Purdue to beat one of those 4 top 10 teams. The closest I would probably come was Penn State, because I have some skepticism about Drew Aller. More to the point, I have skepticism about the skill position talent, especially receiver talent that Penn State has. Their best receiver might be Julian Fleming, who was a guy who transferred from Ohio State and who started for them, but was not an Ohio State wide receiver, as people now know Ohio State wide receivers to be. And so I think that's a game where the defense could match up. I just don't. Penn State's defense is going to be really good. And I think that there's enough talent there that I couldn't quite get there, even though that game is at home for Purdue. And I am not 100% sure yet if I'm going to be so bold as to predict this when I have to predict game by game, but I'm going to predict it here on this podcast. And I'll just hope that everybody who's listening to this pod forgets that I said this by the time they read it, in case I don't decide to pick it when that's on IndyStar.com and JCOnline.com next week. But my boldest prediction, Purdue wins at Wisconsin. Ends the 17-game losing streak. Has not won in this series since 2003. I was not yet in Lafayette. I was still living in Chicago the last time Purdue beat Wisconsin. I was 2 years shy still of even coming to work at the Journal and Courier. So that seems like just ages ago. And the reason why I think this is a legitimate prediction. So Wisconsin is not what it once was yet again. I think it might get there eventually under Luke Fickell. That's why they went and got him. He clearly showed with what he did at Cincinnati that he knows how to build a program that can achieve big things. And he's going to have more resources at Wisconsin to do it, even though the Big Ten's getting tougher. But they're solid right now. I don't look at them as like an imposing power. Another factor, Wisconsin doesn't have a better quarterback than Purdue does. Tanner Mordecai is good. He's fine. He's a good quarterback. The same way you would probably say that about. I think he and Hudson Card are just very, very comparable. Last year I already said Hudson Card's some of Hudson Card's stats. Tanner Mordecai is just barely right above him in Big Ten play in both QB rating and yards per attempt. And except for the fact that he threw far fewer touchdowns in not that different of a number of attempts. So it's not like I think that that's one of the games, unlike Oregon, Ohio State, maybe Notre Dame, and I guess I'm be talking about both sides of my mouth that I thought Drew Aller was. I think he has the talent. I just don't know if he'll put it together. You don't have like a potentially top of the Big Ten quarterback that you have to beat in a game like this. And
yeah,
the third factor, just one real quick thing. The third factor is you got to play teams at the right time, right? Like that's the old Gene Katie adage, right? It's like, it's not who you play, it's when you play him. I think, was he the first one that said that? I think it's attributed to him anyway. This is Wisconsin's record, their season. So they open with Western Michigan and South Dakota, whatever. The next three games, home against Alabama, but you're playing a playoff team, big, huge game. So that's on September 14th. September 28th, so they take a week off. September 28th, they play at USC, and then they come to play Purdue. And I just feel like that is potentially a good point of the season for Purdue to play Wisconsin and be able to spring a big surprise. And I'm not saying that necessarily by beating Wisconsin, they put themselves for sure in that bowl position, because in some ways, if they trip up early on, they might be in better position to pull a surprise. I'm thinking back to 2019. Wisconsin was 6-0. They were about to come play Ohio State the next week when Ohio State was also undefeated. And it was this big clash, J.K. Dobbins, Jonathan Taylor. And Wisconsin first had to go to Champaign, and Illinois, which was, I think, 2-3 at the time, beat them. It was like the one signature win that Lovie Smith ever got. Now, Ryan Walters was not around Illinois for that yet, but it just shows how a game like that can be attainable for a team that the middle to upper middle that's where I think Purdue can reach up and grab one this year. And it's going to be tougher because it's at Camp Randall Stadium, but you also just added a bunch of guys to this program who have had to stand on the sidelines in some big atmospheres like that. And now they're going to get their chance to go out and prove it on the field. And I think they're looking forward to that.
Yeah. And so going back to when this whole losing streak started against Wisconsin, you talked about where you were. I was a senior in college in the Purdue student section. I didn't go to Purdue. I went to Indiana State. I had a friend who was at Purdue who college game day was in West Lafayette. It was a huge deal. He said, "Hey, come here. We're going to do all this. It's a huge game at the time, obviously with game day being in town." And I'm sitting in the Purdue student section and they're all going nuts. And we all know what happens. Kyle Orton tries to jump over somebody, fumbles the ball, it gets returned for a touchdown. Wisconsin wins the game. And Purdue hasn't beaten Wisconsin since then. And it was just kind of this deflating moment where everybody thought Purdue was a national championship contender. And then all of a sudden that kind of snowballed Purdue. And, I even said it in a little roundtable discussion we had yesterday. I think Purdue's just cursed against Wisconsin. But this does look like a year where things set up very well. Like you mentioned, Wisconsin's schedule. I think Purdue has Wisconsin is game 5. And Purdue has, before that, a bye week, I think 3 home games, and you go to Oregon State. So you really have, 1 road game, an off week, and 3 home games. And then you go to Wisconsin, which has already played kind of, a top-tier opponent. And the door's kind of open, especially if Purdue has some success in that early portion of the season. Those first 4 games, like you said, if you come out 3-1, whatever, you've got a lot of confidence going into that game.
Yeah, if you can build any early season momentum, but I also think it could work the other way. Like I've seen when Purdue beat Ohio State in 2018, that was a team that didn't get off to a good start that year and was underachieving when the big team came into Ross-Ade Stadium, and that almost set them up better. Like I don't know if it's an underestimation thing, because being around both kinds of programs now, I can tell you that that's something they preach all week when they're about to play somebody who doesn't have that great of a record. The coaches tell them all week how everybody they're about to line up against is an All-American, right? So it's probably not that necessarily, but it's a team that for whatever reason, and this happened the year before that, actually, when Iowa beat Ohio State, similar circumstances, that you have teams that have clear NFL talent. They're just underachieving a little bit, and then they put it together the right week. And it's, you're trying to thread a needle a little bit. And and I know that Wisconsin has just had Purdue's number for a generation now, and that makes it seem like an outlandish. That's why I put it at boldest, because it does seem so far-fetched probably to some people. But we've also seen Purdue has not been out of reach of Wisconsin in recent years. Obviously, there was a triple overtime game. The year before that, it's a 1-score game. Just a couple years ago, it's still a 10-point game. Like they've been able to score points against Wisconsin. Again, I just think it's a matter of if they're giving up 45, 38 points, no, they're not going to pull that upset. But I think this defense has come along enough. You're going to have someone like Nyland Green presumably back and healthy for that game. You might have that might be one of the first games where your defense is like fully intact and has really had a few games to really come together and start playing as a unit. It falls in an interesting spot of the schedule. And if you pull a win like that, I think Ryan Walters almost has to, I don't want to say he has to get a win like that, but to get a win like that this season, kind of a signature win, can help propel things, can help you not only gain some notoriety for your program, but I think kind of that belief that you were talking about before, it can sort of multiply that.
Yeah, I'm going to kind of piggyback off of your boldest prediction because we've talked about these 4 games that are basically we throw out as, these are unwinnable games. My boldest prediction is that Purdue will beat Notre Dame in the second game of the season. And the main reason that I think that is because Notre Dame's going to see the film on Purdue against Indiana State, and Purdue presumably will have, a Corey Stewart, a Nyland Green, a CJ Smith, guys who aren't in that game that maybe Notre Dame isn't, too high on, and there's potential for a CJ Smith to come in and have a big game if he's ready to go by then. But you're going to have Indiana State 2 weeks to prepare for Notre Dame. And I think Notre Dame plays Northern Illinois maybe during Purdue's bye week after playing Texas A&M. So you get kind of, that's kind of where Notre Dame lines up on the schedule when you play them type of thing that you're mentioning. But I went back to because this used to be an every year series, and then there was a big lull, and then kind of renewed in 2021, and now this is the second game in the renewed rivalry of this series. But the last 19 meetings that these teams have played, Notre Dame's average margin of victory over those 19 games, now Purdue won 5 of them, but still Notre Dame's average margin of victory is 4.3 points. Purdue always, for whatever reason, plays Notre Dame tough, aside from 1 or 2 situations in that stretch. I think there's really only 2 games that you look at and say, yeah, that was lopsided, that was a blowout type game. But you see a lot of these games are 3-point victories, 7-point victories, 6-point victories, even teams of Purdue had that wasn't a very good team. I think back to Robert Marve, I think it was his first start at Notre Dame when he was Purdue's quarterback after transferring to Miami, and Purdue almost knocks off Notre Dame that year. It just seems like this is really, for whatever reason, maybe because of Notre Dame's stature, that Purdue has always gotten up to play and felt like, this is our chance to really make our name on a national stage, because every game Notre Dame plays is on a national stage, as we know. And this is a kind of a situation where Purdue is, in a unique situation to have that early bye week now because of the injuries and because Indiana State is the first game. You don't have to put guys in who aren't 100% to go out and try to get a week 1 victory. Purdue should be 1-0, and then you get some guys back, and you're kind of doing things behind the scenes for 2 weeks to get ready for this game, while Notre Dame is preparing for an opponent, albeit, a game that it should win pretty easily, and then having to turn around after a Saturday game and start preparing for the next week for Purdue.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that game. And I said it earlier in this pod about how the schedule maybe sets them up to take their best shot there. And kudos to you for not stepping on that and blowing your big boldest prediction for the end. It's not unheard of that a Purdue team like this could beat a Notre Dame team. Again, it's all about putting it together at the right moment. And the Notre Dame schedule is very different. Like you're opening with Texas A&M, a high-profile game against either another good team or another overrated team, depending on how you look at Texas and Notre Dame. And then you don't have the bye week. Purdue will have 2 weeks to prepare, another extra week of healing, any healing that may even have to happen after the first game. The thing that has worried me about picking them to win that game has been those guys. Notre Dame will have guys who they'll be third game in, right? A lot of some of the rust is knocked off, the butterflies, whatever. And Purdue would then be relying on a handful of really important guys who are going to be playing their first game of the season. And I don't know how that's going to affect things. It obviously helps that it's at Ross-Ade Stadium. I think Nyland Green and CJ Smith and some of these other guys are going to make an impact and be important players for this team. I just don't know if being the first game out affects this in some way. I do, though. I was going to go look, and it doesn't look like they've posted a line for this game, but I'm interested if Notre Dame beats Texas A&M, and there's a lot of people out there who are like the gambling folks who are really hammering, like Notre Dame is, I think, as of this week, was still like an underdog in that game, and they're like, what are you people talking about? You need to go put all your money on Notre Dame to win that game outright. Like, they think it could actually be an avalanche in Notre Dame's favor. So if they're 2-0 with a big win over Texas A&M, that betting line could be pretty significant for a game like this, and I think there's a good chance for Purdue to cover it, which is not something that's going to pacify them by any means, but they're going to face some really big point spreads against those four teams this year, at the very least, and they could face one against Wisconsin too, considering games on the road. And I think like beating the spread in those games doesn't mean anything in terms of wins and losses, but it absolutely can mean things in terms of momentum if it's reflective of how you competed in those games. And I think it's possible that Purdue could compete with Notre Dame in a game like this, especially, again, considering it's going to be a big home game.
Yeah, and because Purdue is going to be 1-0, the season ticket sales have been tremendous for Purdue this year. Part of that is probably because of a couple of the teams that are coming to Ross-Ade and the following that those programs have. People are going to buy season tickets and then try to sell off the other games just to go to the one game that they want. But there is a good following for this team coming off a 4-8 season, where it seems like a lot of people that I talk to locally here, they really think that Purdue's got something going on here. And that, I know that doesn't mean anything, but there is a buy-in. Like, people think something's happening here, so they're going to go to that game. It's going to be a crazy environment. I don't know if you were at the last Purdue Notre Dame game at Ross-Ade, but I mean, it was wild. It was loud.
Was that? So I haven't been here obviously the last 5 seasons. The last one I remember being at was Charlie Weiss was still Notre Dame's head coach. Is it that long ago?
No, that's a while ago, but yeah, I think that was 2014.
Oh yeah. That's probably it. I remember being at a game at Notre Dame Stadium and like going down to the field and walking around Notre Dame Stadium late in that game, and how awesome of an experience that was. And then I remember that game you're talking about, if it's the same one, Notre Dame or Purdue had a chance to win that game too. And was it a night game? I think it might have been a night game.
Yeah.
And Danny Hope made some kind of asinine timeout decision late in that game that opened the door for Notre Dame to win.
Yeah, I think 2014, I think, was maybe at Notre Dame Stadium, and I think it was Brian Kelly's first game as head coach. I think the year before was maybe Charlie Weiss, and that was the situation we're talking about, and that was a night game at Ross-Ade where he called timeout, and everybody, all of us in the press box were like, why did they stop the clock? And then come to find out, Danny Hope called a timeout and basically given Notre Dame a free play to go win the game, basically. So, but back to my point, a game that came down to the final minute of the game, the final plays of the game, always seems to kind of be that way, especially at Ross-Ade. There's kind of this anticipation where if Purdue beats Notre Dame, you really accomplished something. It's always been, probably kind of back in the day, when teams would go play Indiana, whether it was like an Evansville or an Indiana State or somebody like that in men's basketball, and it was like this super juggernaut that's always a top 10 team, and you really get up to go play that team. It feels like Purdue, kind of equatable in the football perspective, is kind of little brother in that regard. We're like, here's this other program that's elite in our state, that we, a lot of the players probably know each other or whatever else. And clearly the head coach at Notre Dame is familiar with what Purdue is because he used to be here. But you kind of really just get amped up. And I think that this is a chance because of the schedule. I know that you said that one team's going to have one more game played, but I think that there's, an element of surprise maybe with somebody like a CJ Smith that wasn't on the scouting report, or that, if you look at the scouting report or what he did at Georgia, you're not going to be like, well, that's the guy that's going to come in here and blow us away.
I wonder if they'll use the Madden ratings as part of their scouting report, because that certainly says that CJ Smith is someone that they should pay attention to. I think you're right. It may not be a binary choice. It may not be a factor at all as to whether or not the guys have played yet. These teams are so extensively scouted now that I have a feeling that they will definitely point out that Nyland Green was once a highly touted prospect who just wasn't getting a big opportunity to play there, and that CJ Smith is a scorcher, and et cetera, et cetera. I think it will just come down to execution. But if, again, all things are possible, I think this year, because the offensive performance should not, when I say all things are possible, I don't mean like 12-0 is possible. But I'm saying that any one of these things is possible, because I don't think the offensive performance drops from last year. I think it gets better. The offensive line being intact and healthy, having another second running back to help Devin Mockabee, Hudson Card another year, the receivers being better across the board. Like, the offense should step up. It definitely shouldn't fall down. And the defense, I think, absolutely is better than last year. I think collectively should be better. So that just puts more things on the table than what this team was capable of doing last year. It's just a hard combination of how many times they're now asked to try to go beat a top 10 team this year. How many times, if you take those 4 games to set them aside, and you take the Indiana State game and set it aside, you've got to win 5 of the other 7 to be bowl eligible. And it's not a lot of margin for error if the defense is still giving up 30-some points a game, and if the offense is still having those problems on third down and red zone and things like that. If you see improvement in those small areas, it can really maximize what this team's capable of.
Yeah, and even the games that look like they were, Ohio State came into Ross-Ade last year and just beat the crap out of Purdue. But Purdue went to Michigan, and despite what the final score was, I felt like Purdue was competitive against Michigan, which had way better talent than Purdue last year. It was a few big plays, and it was just like, if you go back and look at it, some bonehead, unsportsmanlike conduct penalties and things of that nature that gave Michigan chances that, obviously Michigan was the national champion last year. You can't do that against a team of that caliber, because it's going to make you pay for those situations. So in a lot of ways, I feel like Purdue was more competitive last year than when you just look at the schedule, the point differential in some of those games, and a team that was 4-8. Even in the games where it was blown out, I think the Syracuse game, for example, it was just really one player, a quarterback that rushed for a gazillion yards in one night. Other than that, Purdue did some pretty decent things, and then Devin Mockabee clearly had a night he'd love to forget, because I think he fumbled 6 or 7 times in that game, and so much so that we had requested him the following week at practice, and we're basically like, that's not going to happen. So you got to clean up some of those things, and those games that are definitely the 50-50 games, or even 60-40 games that you have to play very well to win. But the potential was there last year to kind of sneak up and knock somebody off. It didn't happen for a myriad of reasons, but I think the potential is even greater this year that you win one of those Ohio State, Penn State, Oregon, Notre Dame games. And because of the timing, or I guess in your case, Wisconsin even, I think the timing of the Notre Dame game, and even the Wisconsin game, like you said, is kind of great for Purdue. As much as we talk about the schedule is an awful schedule to have for Purdue, the timing of some of these games probably is in Purdue's favor.
Yeah, and again, going back to that, it matters when you play them. Last year, that was a pretty turbulent time for Michigan. Like, that was when everything was kind of coming out about the scandal at Michigan.
And Brian Walters definitely made a comment that even heightened.
So you were playing a team that was a bit distracted. I'm not taking anything away from Purdue's performance, but it goes back to you can catch a team at the opportune time sometimes. And also, to go back to something else I said, when you're looking for these upsets, are you going to have to go beat a better quarterback? Look at Riley Leonard's numbers. You go back to 2022 when he got to play a full season at Duke. They were all right. Last year, in a smaller performance, basically he had the same kind of numbers, actually a little bit worse in some ways than Hudson Card. Like, I don't know that he's significantly better quarterback than what Purdue is going to have. And so right there, that alone, if you're equating those two positions, or if you can be a little bit better than that other guy, then all the rest of that talent obviously matters, but that's the most important position on the field for a reason. And I think if it's something to keep in mind for some of these games, that some of these really great teams, actually, I mean, you could even argue it about Will Howard at Ohio State. I think Dylan Gabriel is a pretty good college quarterback. You can argue it about Drew Aller at Penn State. Like, there's some guys who have kind of middling performances or haven't really had like elite performances yet in their career. And some of the best teams on this schedule are asking those guys to go out and carry talented rosters where they're supposed to go. And it does leave some level of vulnerability, I think, in at least a couple of those games. But now I do think, though, I want to make sure people understand this was bolder, boldest. It is kind of like, okay, best case scenario, here's something that could happen. And some of that is like avoiding the big injury or whatever. And some of that is also just the things that we've seen in camp that sort of lean in one direction end up getting to the finish line.
Yeah, I could go out August 31st, watch Purdue play Indiana State, and come out of that thinking there's no way this team's going to beat Notre Dame. Or I could come out of that and think, well, this team is way better than we even thought after seeing it practice for the last 3 or 4 weeks. So yeah, there's still a lot of things up in the air, obviously. And do I in 3 weeks project Purdue to beat Notre Dame? We'll see. But as of right now,
right,
asking me to make a boldest prediction, and when you're taking a lot of things into account, I said, you know what, that is possible. That is something that, if it happened, it wouldn't be the most shocking thing in the world to me that Purdue would knock off, what maybe at that time is a 1-1 Notre Dame team, but at the same time, maybe is a top 5 Notre Dame team.
Well, those are our boldest predictions for the 2024 season, which begins a week from Saturday, August 31st. We will be out at practice again next week, documenting what's going on there as Purdue gets ready to play Indiana State in that season opener. And then we will be there 2 weeks later when the Fighting Irish come in for a huge game early in the year. For Sam King, I'm Nathan Baird. Come back to jconline.com, indystar.com all week. We have a ton of season preview stuff planned for next week. Thanks for joining us.